In our on-demand a la carte world, it's easier than ever to get news, but harder than ever to get the full story. That's why I use Ground News. It's not just another news app. It's a powerful tool that brings together over 30,000 articles a day from across the political spectrum. What I love about Ground News is its transparency, because for every story, you can see which outlets are covering it, their respective political leanings, and even who owns them. It's kind of like having X-ray vision for the news. And their blind spot feed is a game changer, showing you stories that your usual sources might be overlooking. So if you're tired of feeling like you're only getting part of the picture, go check out ground.news. And if you like what you find, you can use my link in the show notes for a 15% discount on any subscription. You'll be supporting this podcast and promoting media transparency. And now, on to the episode. I'm your host, Michael Callahan. This is Where We Go Next. And we live in an era of viral misinformation and a deepening political divide, increasingly shaped by algorithms that reward outrage over accuracy, while our own biases can blind us to inconvenient truths. So how do we separate fact from fiction? Our guest this week shares fascinating research that helps to explain why we believe what we believe, how social media warps our perceptions, and what we can do to foster a more informed and less polarized society. Steve Rathje is a postdoctoral researcher in social psychology at New York University, studying how polarization and intergroup conflict interact with social media and artificial intelligence. He is also a science communicator with over 1 million followers on his psychology TikTok channel. Steve, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'm glad that we're both glad that you're here. Now, I want to start off with something that really grabbed me from your research paper titled, quote, "Outgroup Animosity Drives Engagement on Social Media." Quote, "Posts about political opponents are substantially more likely to be shared on social media, and that this outgroup effect is much stronger than other established predictors of social media sharing, such as emotional language," end quote. And then later, quote, "Outgroup language is the strongest predictor of social media engagement across all relevant predictors measured, suggesting that social media may be creating perverse incentives for content expressing outgroup animosity," end quote. And just to start us off, because I think this is kind of the backbone of a lot of your research, how our own biases and political groupings can affect the information that we believe, the information that we share with each other, I would love for you to just start out and expand a little bit on this study.
So this was one of the first papers I published in my PhD, and it's also one of my favorite papers that I published that laid the groundwork for a lot of my future work. I was really inspired by a number of other papers in the field, which suggested that using moral language in social media posts increases social media virality. So one well-known study found that if you use moral words like hate or blame in a social media post, this social media post is especially likely to go viral. And I wanted to expand on this research, and I was also really interested in research on polarization. I was also just noticing the increasing polarization in, the country and around the world. And I wanted to look at how social media might play a role in increasing polarization. So for this study, I looked at a number of large-scale data sets by Congress members and news media sources, and I looked at whether these politicians or news sources would use words about the political in-group versus political out-group. So for instance, if there was a social media post by President Biden and it said something about Trump, that would be a post about the out-group. Whereas if Biden was talking about Kamala Harris, that would be a post about the in-group. And I wanted to look at how in-group versus out-group language might impact virality on social media. And a lot of this work was inspired by work in social identity theory and social psychology. So there's a lot of work in social psychology that suggests that we have large in-group biases. So we have preferential feelings toward our in-groups and sort of detrimental feelings toward our out-groups. But in the United States, a lot of scholars have noticed that partisanship seems to abide by what's called negative partisanship. So basically, we hate our outgroups more than we love our in-groups. And you can probably see this a lot in terms of this election in the United States. Democrats don't seem particularly excited about Biden, but they really hate Trump. And it seems to be vice versa for Republicans, except for maybe those few Trump supporters who really love Trump. But there's a lot of negative partisanship in the United States. But when I did this data analysis, the results really kind of shocked me, actually, in terms of how big the effect sizes were. Basically, I found that if you used a word about an in-group on social media, this didn't lead to any change in the number of likes and retweets that you got on a social media post. However, each additional word about the political out-group that you used in a social media post led to about a 70% increase in the number of shares and retweets a post received. So when a politician or a news source talked about an outgroup, they went really viral. And this effect, it was about the same size on both Twitter and Facebook, and it was also about the same size amongst Democrats and Republicans. So it was really consistent. And we also found that this outgroup effect was much bigger than other effects noted in the literature. So it was bigger than the effect of moral words. It was bigger than the effect of emotional words. It seemed to be that mentioning an outgroup made you go really viral. And of course, when people mention an outgroup, they basically uniformly mentioned an outgroup in a negative way. So one example of an outgroup related social media posts, this was a post from Breitbart News. This was one of the really viral posts in our data sets. It was basically a video of Joe Biden not sounding particularly articulate, and it said, "Look at Joe Biden's most recent brain freeze," basically. So a social media post like that went really, really viral on Twitter and really viral on Facebook. And of course, you can immediately think of some of the negative consequences of these dynamics on social media. If we live in a social media landscape in which you're incentivized to constantly post negative things about your outgroup, and this doesn't even need to be a political outgroup. It could be an age-related outgroup. I mean, you see Gen Z might say, "Okay, boomer." You might say something really negative about a certain group of people, or you might see anti-immigrant rhetoric on social media. There could be all sorts of examples on this. It seems like this kind of content is especially good at attracting our attention and going viral. And of course, while this work is correlational, you can imagine there might be negative downstream consequences for polarization in our democracy if we go onto social media and all we really see is negative content about outgroups, both from our own political party and the opposing political party.
You're a researcher with the Social Identity and Morality Lab, and what you just said is deeply related to the research of that lab, which, quote, examines what happens to people psychologically when they define themselves in terms of group memberships, end quote. The topic of group identity is deeply embedded within the core of this show through dozens of episodes. And one of the things that I really enjoy talking about, which I'd love to explore with you, is how our group identities are actually quite malleable and how we define those. Like, we like to think of, I think probably because we're hyper incentivized by things like social media, but we're encouraged every day to think of these group identities as really hardened, almost like these exoskeletons that we're confined to for our entire lives. But in fact, how our group identities are formed and what they are can change day to day, even moment to moment. I mean, to use an example that you just spoke to, is an increasing dissatisfaction among Democrats around Joe Biden, where if like just 2 weeks ago, that didn't exist.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was a huge switch. Yeah,
exactly. But you could say like, okay, maybe 2 weeks ago, in-group, out-group, classically defined Republican, Democrat. Now there's a schism within the Democratic Party where there's an almost in-group, out-group dynamic within the party of people who want Biden to go, people who want Biden to stay. And so I imagine you could post something about Biden online right now, and it can trigger an out-group dynamic depending on how you feel about him as a candidate.
Yeah, and there's a lot of research right now on how there is polarization between parties, and then there's also polarization within parties. And you definitely see that on both the right and the left, with sort of center leftists and then more extreme leftists, and you see a lot of disagreements there. And yeah, I'm also very interested in motivated reasoning, sort of our tendency to believe what we want to believe. And I think you saw a lot of dynamics maybe with Joe Biden. We can talk about that since that's current in the news, and that maybe Democrats were more motivated to see him in a very positive light and to see him as articulate and everything. And Republicans were especially motivated, the example tweet I gave, to see everything he said in the most negative light and see everything that he said as an example of his feeble mind, etc. But of course, there's been a change that sort of happened in the party recently with the debate where Democrats have now maybe started to give up a little bit more on Biden and are looking for solutions. Yeah, literature and motivated reasoning suggests that while to a certain extent we believe what we want to believe and our motivations shape belief, we're also limited by reality. And there can be times where reality just hits us in the face and we can't continue to be biased anymore. And it seems like that happened recently with Joe Biden's debate. And I'm really curious what's going to happen in the Democratic Party, because I know my Twitter feed is filled with people talking about Kamala and everything like that. So it's just seems like it's an internal struggle. But yeah, going back to your question about how identities are malleable, that's absolutely true. My advisor, Professor Jay Van Bavel, who's head of the Social Identity and Morality Lab, he has a great book on social identity called Power of Us. And he studies, and we study together, topics like polarization, misinformation, everything, but we all view it through the lens of social identity. And we hold a lot of social identities with us. We have a partisan identity, but we also have all sorts of identities. We could be our racial identities, sexual identities, being a postdoc, being a psychologist, being
mother, daughter, son, father, friend.
Exactly. Your familial identities, everything. And certain identities can be more activated based on certain contexts. And research suggests that if you activate these identities, you're more likely to behave in line with your identities. And we think that social media is a context in which our partisan identities can often be hyperactivated. When we go on social media and we constantly see people, talking about, people will say in their Twitter profile that they are a proud Democrat or proud Republican. And research has actually analyzed people's Twitter bios over time and found that over the past 5 years, people have been using more and more political identity language in their Twitter bios. So it seems like social media is a place where our social identities are hyperactivated. But identities can be pretty arbitrary, and they're not quite as fixed as people think. So there are these classic experiments called minimal group experiments where people would arbitrarily assign identities in the lab. So you would take people into the lab and you would say, half of you are assigned to the red team and half of you are assigned to the blue team. These psychologists found that even if someone is given an arbitrary identity, they will start experiencing favoritism toward their own identity and dislike toward the outgroup, basically. So people on the red team will give more money to other members of the red team, and they will give less money to members of the blue team. So these studies show that it's really easy to create an arbitrary identity and activate those identities. And those arbitrary identities can often become really important to us. I mean, you see this in real world contexts. You see this in sports. You see a lot of in-group, out-group dynamics in sports and people getting really attached to these identities that are quite arbitrary. And this is actually somewhat hopeful because it suggests that a lot of intergroup conflict and polarization might not be as set in stone as we think it is, because one of the most common ways to sort of reduce outgroup derogation or dislike of the outgroup is to create some sort of a shared identity. So one example for soccer, if there's two opposing soccer teams and they really hate each other, if you emphasize that you all are soccer fans, studies have shown that this creates less dislike of the outgroup. And I mean, you can do this in the United States, for instance, as well. Studies have shown that if you emphasize a common American identity, it makes Democrats and Republicans hate each other less. And there have also been studies that show that if there is a common outgroup threat, this seems to also reduce polarization. And we saw this in the United States, I think around 9/11. After 9/11, there was this outgroup threat that was experienced, and the United States seemed to become much more patriotic. There was also this, what's called a rally around the flag effect, support for Bush went up extremely amongst both Republicans and Democrats. There's something about experiencing this new outgroup threat that makes you take what was once your outgroup and be like, oh, we are actually all Americans. So the fact that identities are flexible is also practical because it gives us ways to reduce outgroup discrimination in the real world.
I'm assuming you've seen that brilliant ad campaign from Heineken called Worlds Apart.
Oh, yes.
It just made me think of that, where basically, for anyone unfamiliar, it has two people without any context come into this warehouse and basically build a bar together. This kind of a simplification of an IKEA-esque style bar, and then have a beer together. And then they find out as they're about to have their beer that they're actually on opposite ends of the political spectrum when it comes to something like feminism or climate change or LGBT rights. And then they have to make that decision. Are they still going to have that beer or not? But over the course of the hour or so that they spent building that bar together, they realize that they actually have a lot in common. And that this big dividing line that they think makes them so different is actually, when it comes to day-to-day interactions, rather trivial.
Right, right. I actually love that you brought up that example too, because I participated in this study called the Strengthening Democracy Challenge. It's what's called a mega study, which is where, a bunch of psychologists come together and they test a number of interventions head to head. Basically, what happened is more than 250 teams all submitted interventions to try to reduce polarization that psychologists would later test in a massive 30,000 person experiment. Then a team of researchers picked the 25 sort of best interventions that they thought might be most effective at reducing polarization. And the Heineken ad was actually one of those 25 interventions that they picked to try to reduce polarization. So that's what I mentioned it here.
Oh, how cool.
My team, so myself and Dr. Jay Van Bavel, my advisor, and a few other collaborators, we also designed an intervention to try to reduce polarization. So they would show all these people interventions. They would show like 1,000 people each one of these interventions, compare it to a control condition and see what was the best at both reducing polarization, reducing support for political violence, and also strengthening democratic attitudes. In our intervention, we called it the common identity-based intervention. So it tried to employ a lot of the principles that I talked about just earlier. We emphasized the fact that people are all Americans, and we corrected a lot of people's misperceptions about the opposing parties. Research shows that a lot of Democrats and Republicans think that the other side is much more extreme and hates their own side a lot more than is actually true. So people have radical misperceptions about the opposing party, when in reality, most people are actually quite moderate. So we corrected misperceptions about the opposing party. We basically said, how much do you think the other side hates you? Sort of like on a scale of 0 to 100. We gave people the opportunity to answer, and then we gave them the actual statistic about how much the other side disliked them. And it's actually a lot less than people think. And we corrected all sorts of misperceptions about the opposing party. We talked about how much the opposing party actually supports political violence and everything. And most people think the opposing party supports political violence much more than they actually do. So we emphasize the fact that Democrats and Republicans are all, in general, besides a few extremists, are more moderate than people think. And we also emphasize this common identity around the fact that we're all Americans. And luckily, our intervention was actually the third most successful intervention at reducing polarization out of the 25 that were tested. So we were happy that our intervention actually worked when it was tested. And the Heineken intervention was actually the number one intervention at reducing polarization. Like the Heineken ad was the best one. And I think part of the reason it did so well is it employed all those principles that I talked about creating a common identity, but it also did so in a very human and engaging way. It was a high budget ad. It was very well edited. It was well done. It basically humanized the other side. And when we log into social media, I see just and Twitter has become crazy, especially with all of Elon Musk's changes and everything. And I see sort of the most extreme takes from both sides. And it's because those takes seem to do very well on Twitter. Twitter is not sort of a place for nuance. And basically, any social media platform is not really a place for nuance, especially in what we call the attention economy, where social media posts that grab our attention most are the ones that go most viral. And generally, what grabs our attention is animosity toward outgroups, extremism, negativity, all these sort of things that seem to be bad for our democracy. But because social media platforms are all businesses and they want to keep you on the platform as long as possible to make ad revenue, this is sort of a difficult problem to fix because companies like Facebook don't necessarily have the incentive to fix this issue. They want to keep people on social media, and this is what keeps people on social media. And the New York Times actually reported that Facebook has tried in the past to implement solutions to reduce extremism on the platform, but they found that some of the solutions they implement actually reduce engagement. And as soon as the executives learn that the solutions they implement reduce engagement, they will choose not to implement it.
Yeah, God forbid engagement goes down.
And yeah, they don't have the incentive to improve these platforms. And they've also all started firing their trust and safety teams and everyone who works on misinformation I mean, Elon Musk, when he took over Twitter, he fired about 80% of employees. And a lot of these employees were people who were creating these classifiers that would detect violence and misinformation. And I think that emboldened a lot of other social media platforms to fire those people. I knew a lot of psychologists who worked at Facebook and who worked on important issues like misinformation. And a lot of the people I knew have been fired at this point. So yeah, it's an unfortunate state.
And I want to dig into misinformation with you in just a bit. Before we get there, I think it's important to first touch on the dangers of conformity. One of your most popular videos on TikTok shows an experiment involving a research subject in a crowded waiting room, thinking she's about to be part of a psychology study. And then the room suddenly begins to fill with smoke, and no one in the waiting room reacts as if anything is wrong because everyone in the room but the subject is an actor. After looking around at everyone else's non-reactions, the woman decides to do nothing as well. And the original version of the experiment found that 90% of the people put in this situation also decided to do nothing as the room filled with smoke. But when a different group of subjects were each put into a room alone without any paid actors to influence them, 75% of those subjects took action when the room filled with smoke. So, Steve, what does this study say about human behavior, and how does it relate to patterns of behavior on social media sites like Facebook, X, and Instagram?
Yeah, I love that you brought up that TikTok. That's one of my favorites that I've filmed, partially because it comes with, a video of the woman in the study, and it's really compelling. Often we hear the results of studies, but we don't actually watch the study participant. I remember before I posted that video, which is one of my most viral videos on TikTok, I showed the video to my mom and she just couldn't stop laughing at the study subject. And I was like, okay, this is how I know this video is going to go viral, because it's really compelling to watch. And I also find the comments on that video so interesting because people comment all sorts of things. They comment like, this is exactly how Republicans are. This is exactly how Democrats are. And they usually comment something that supports their beliefs. Like anti-vaxxers will come in and they'll be like, oh, this is how everyone was with the vaccines. Or people will say, this is basically what my outgroup does and why my outgroup is bad and why my outgroup conforms and are sheeple. But these comments seem to be blind to the fact that, everyone conforms. And certainly some people conform more than others, but it's not just your outgroup who's conforming.
And I assume, actually, that it's kind of natural.
Yeah.
When I go to a country that is totally foreign to me and I see people who are citizens of that nation act a certain way when it comes to cultural norms or politeness, or even something as simple as like take your shoes off when you go inside, or like bow, or just things that are foreign to you, but you see everyone in the room doing, you do it as well. And I imagine the same thing is happening in the human mind when something like this happens.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really uncomfortable for us to defy social norms. And, I did my PhD in the UK, so I was in the UK for a few years, and the social norms, you think the UK would be very similar to the United States, but it's not. The social norms are quite different, and they're very subtly different. I was at Cambridge, and especially in a place like Cambridge where things are a little bit more traditional, hierarchical. There's so many subtle things that are different, and I think it just makes us very uncomfortable as humans to violate social norms. And what we know from decades of research in social psychology is just how closely people follow social norms. They don't follow necessarily what you tell people they should do. They follow how other people are behaving. There's a classic study in social psychology called the petrified wood study or something like that, where there was a sign in a park that says, don't steal this valuable petrified wood or whatever. And one condition, they say like, too many people are stealing this wood, don't do this. But when you say, don't do this because all of these people are stealing this wood and it's really bad for the park, people conform and they start stealing the wood as well, because even though they're told not to do it, they see that other people are doing it. So they're like, okay, people are more sensitive to social norms than being told, just don't do this. Basically, we know from social psychology that social norms are one of the most powerful ways to influence behavior. And this is both good and bad. A lot of people think it's just bad that we're so sensitive to social norms, but sometimes conformity is a good thing. Sometimes it can lead to social cohesion, especially when you're using social norms for good. And a lot of social psychologists try to use social norm interventions, for instance, to promote pro-environmental behavior. Social psychologists have found one of the most effective strategies for increasing pro-environmental behavior is to say more and more people are doing this, more and more people are recycling, or they're eating vegetarian, or they're doing this and this, because people will see that more and more people are doing this, and then they'll do something good. I think what is negative about social norms is that people's perceptions of social norms are often inaccurate. There's a famous study that looks at college students and their perceived social norms about how much other college students are drinking. And a lot of students drink on campus because they think everyone else is doing it. They see salient examples of like, oh, everyone's partying, so I have to drink, and they feel pressured. But then if you give people accurate information about what the actual social norm is, it's true that only a few students drink heavily, then people will drink less, basically. I think what we have a problem with is not necessarily the fact that we're too conformist. It's that people conform with inaccurate norms, basically. And a clear example of that is social media, where people might think that the norm is to be really toxic or to share misinformation, when that actually isn't the norm at all. If you sort of look at the statistics, it's only an extremely small percentage of people who are contributing toxic comments to Reddit, who are sharing misinformation online. And my colleagues actually just conducted a study where if you actually tell people that only a small percentage of people share toxic content and share misinformation on social media, people will feel a lot less cynical about the world and about the general population. They'll be like, oh, wow, I thought the norm was much, much higher. So yeah, this is something on social media where our social media feed does not represent what's actually the norm in the world, but people often view their social media feed as the actual social norm.
It feels like a version of what philosopher and psychologist Rene Girard called mimetic desire. He had this quote that said, quote, "Man is the creature who does not know what to desire, and he turns to others in order to make up his mind. We desire what others desire because we imitate their desires," end quote.
Oh, that's absolutely true. Yeah, I like that quote a lot.
I imagine your audience on TikTok skews younger. Going to something you said about how with the smoke in the lobby study and people in the comments were saying, oh, this is exactly what Republicans do, or this is exactly what liberals do, et cetera. Have you, I'm just guessing based on demographics and some stereotypical assumptions here, that your audience probably trends more liberal than conservative. I've seen videos where you say, you know, Fox News viewers tend to do this, or conservatives are more susceptible than liberals in this. But have you posted any videos that kind of turn the lens towards, hey, here's how people who are more liberally minded or identify as liberal politically can also fall susceptible to things like misinformation, or are also more likely than conservatives to XYZ? And if so, how has your audience reacted to that information?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, the thing is, I try not to be politically biased when I can. I once actually asked them using a poll how many of them were like liberal versus conservative. And I think it was about 90% liberal, but I have some pretty vocal conservatives who follow me as well. And, you know, I lean more liberal, and I try to also talk about things that I care about, which sometimes can be like climate change or LGBTQ issues. And sometimes my audience has an issue with that. But I also, you know, I want to talk about things that I believe are important topics. But I also try not to like be too politically biased. I really don't want to turn away any groups of people. I think science is valuable for everyone, and psychology is mostly filled with liberal people. And I don't want conservatives to. We already have a problem in which a lot of conservatives are anti-science and they are more critical. So, and we don't want that to happen. So I think it's important for me as a scientist to be both authentic, but also relatively politically neutral.
The reason I bring this up is because something that I've encountered, and I imagine you've encountered as well in your line of work, is I've always been fascinated by social psychology and why we behave the way we behave, and how all of us as human beings are susceptible to things like misinformation and manipulation, right? And I have a lot of liberal friends here in Los Angeles, and I also have conservative relatives who live around the United States. And one thing that I found that is common, regardless of political affiliation, is that if I'm sharing studies that flatter the group that I'm talking to, they tend to be very pro-science and very pro the data. But if I share studies that are critical of the group that I'm talking about, they tend to be very skeptical or even deny out of hand what I'm citing. And that is across the board. Whether the group I'm talking to is liberal or conservative, people just tend to have a reaction to something that's not flattering. And is that something that you've encountered?
Yes, absolutely. I can't think of salient examples where I've been critical of liberals. But the thing is, I don't want any of us to like fall for the trap that it's only our outgroup that is biased and stupid and motivated. And there are smart people on all sides of the political aisle. And it's not just you who has the right political views and unbiased. We could all be wrong about everything, which is really important to have intellectual humility, in my opinion, about our own bias. And I think people way underestimate their biases. And in misinformation research, there are more studies that happen to be critical of conservatives, because a lot of the data shows that conservatives tend to believe in and share more misinformation. Liberals believe in and share misinformation as well, but there seems to be an asymmetry where especially extreme conservatives believe in and share more misinformation. And I do notice that some of my studies, if the conclusions can be interpreted as hypercritical of conservatives, my liberal audience will really like it. And it's that exact phenomena of outgroup animosity going viral on social media. And I don't love that. I don't think that's like an impulse we should play into. We should engage a little bit less in partisan schadenfreude and take time to be aware of our own biases. But that's probably not something that's going to be loved on social media if you're like, okay, everyone, you're biased too. You're biased on the left, you're biased on the right, whatever like that. People might not love that as much.
I just worry about a doom loop, right? Because of what you were saying about how there aren't that many conservatives in a lot of the social sciences, especially. And then maybe there's a young, potentially more politically conservative, boy or girl who's interested in entering this field, but then they see these results that tend to like belittle them. And then it just creates this negative feedback loop that continues to deprive your field of people who are more politically conservative. A broader question, actually, Steve, is how do you control for the inherent or implicit bias among researchers if the field tends to be more liberal? How do you control for that to make sure that implicit biases within the field are being accounted for?
That's a really good question, and I probably don't have the full answer, because it is true that we find this result that conservatives tend to believe in and share more misinformation, but we have to be very careful about the stimuli we choose, what we classify as misinformation. Like, it's really hard to come to that conclusion carefully and to check our own biases. So I've done some research showing that if you motivate people to be accurate, they become more accurate. So for example, if you give people financial incentives to correctly identify true versus false news, they become better at identifying true versus false news, and they report decreased intentions to share misinformation. Conversely, this study found that if you make people's partisan identity very salient, this makes people actually less accurate. So this speaks to what I talked about earlier, about how this incentive structure of social media, which makes us constantly think about our partisan identities, might distract us from accuracy. And if social media was redesigned so it would make accuracy salient or motivate us to be accurate more, we might become more accurate. But going back to the question of science, I think, and some people might disagree with this, but I think in most cases, and ideally, science is a place where we are motivated to be accurate. And we also have things that are set up, such as peer review. We have other scientists who look for all the possible flaws in our work, and they criticize our work. When we publish a paper, we have this long peer review process that is really intense and can take up to a year. And in many cases, this peer review seems to reduce bias. And my advisor, Jay Van Devel, and his colleagues have actually done a study where they looked at whether politically left-leaning studies were less likely to replicate. So by replicate, I mean if you repeat the study, whether those studies will get worse results. And they were testing the hypothesis that you sort of bring up, that maybe science is easier on more left-leaning conclusions. Maybe the least replicable studies will be the left-leaning conclusions because scientists want to believe, they're leftists, they want to believe left-leaning conclusions. And he didn't find much evidence for this. Basically, there was no impact on whether a study was right-leaning versus left-leaning versus centrists, on whether that study was likely to replicate in the future. And sort of his hypothesis, as well as his colleagues, this was a big team effort, this study, was that sort of the peer review process and the incentive structure of science seems to weed out a lot of these concerns. So ideally, the structure of science and peer review makes us less biased. It might not fully get rid of bias, and there's also a deeper conversation about ideological diversity. I know Jonathan Haidt has talked about how science needs more ideological diversity, and perhaps we should invite more conservatives to participate in science. That created a big debate among the field. Some people have noted that maybe conservatives tend to want to be interested in science more, whereas others will say, no, there's not an inclusive environment for conservatives. So there's a big debate around ideological diversity and how much we should push for it in the field. But in general, I think it's good to have people of differing viewpoints look at your work and criticize your work, and not even from an ideological perspective. I've often had peer reviewers on my papers who they disagree with my theories, or they come from a different theoretical background, and they have pushed me to think about the flaws in my work, and that has really, really helped me. So I think incentive structures like that, where if you have people who disagree with you sort of think through your work and the shared motivation is to come to accurate conclusions, I think that reduces bias. We're not impenetrable to bias, and we should always try to check our biases as much as we can. Especially as social psychologists, we should be the most aware of how biased humans can be.
Looping back to something you said about replication, I wonder if we could take a small detour here because you likely know a lot more about this particular topic than I do. I keep hearing things and reading headlines about the replication crisis in science and specifically certain fields of science. What is the replication crisis? How big of a deal is it? Is it overblown? Is it actually real? What's your knowledge on this?
This is a big and interesting topic that I definitely have a lot of thoughts about. To give some context, I guess, for the listeners, there were a few big events that happened around 2010 that started this concern about replication. So basically, replication, if you repeat a study a second time, will it get the same results? And two big things happened around 2010. So one is that a famous psychologist named Daryl Benn published a 9-study paper in one of the top psychology journals where he found that people could predict the future. And he did a bunch of experiments. He did them with typical psychology methods. And the results he found, this wasn't, I think, satirical or anything at all. Some people thought it was a joke. But he found that basically people could predict the future. So he showed something that was physically impossible. And if his conclusion was true, would defy all laws of physics. And this was published in, a top psychology journal. And this created a big question, if our current psychological methods can predict this, is there maybe a problem with psychological methods? And then around the same time, the Open Science Collaboration decided to replicate 100 studies, 100 popular studies within social psychology published in top journals. And they only found that if you repeated those studies a second time, if you replicated them, they would only get the same results maybe around a third of the time. So a lot of notable studies didn't replicate. And it especially seemed like the studies with surprising conclusions didn't replicate. In the 2010s especially, I would say, published in some of the top journals were studies with very surprising conclusions. So here's an example. It was called the Lady Macbeth effect. It was published in one of the top journals, Science, and it found that if you washed your hands, it would make you, I believe, feel less guilty, kind of like Lady Macbeth washed her sins away. And it was something like embodied cognition. And, we think through our body and these embodied metaphors. And there were a lot of studies like that coming out. And people were like, this just doesn't seem quite plausible. I don't want to get too into statistics here. But if you do a study with a small sample, so let's say it's 50 people, and you assign half of people to an experimental condition and half to a control condition, the study is what we would call underpowered. Basically, the smaller the sample, the more likely you are to come up with false positive conclusions. So you might just find that the experimental condition differs in some baseline way than the control condition, and you might come up with a false positive conclusion that's more random. And psychologists can also do something called a p-hack, basically. If your p-value is low, that means the result of your study is statistically significant. But if you do something like, these data points are outliers, or, let's only look at the men and not the women, or let's analyze this and not this, you can sort of trick your way into finding a significant conclusion if you just massage the data enough. So it seems like that was really popular in social psychology, using too small of samples.
Just to hold on that real quick.
Yeah.
Are you saying that there were scientists who wanted to reach a conclusion and then gamed their study so they would reach the conclusion they wanted to reach before they began the study?
Probably.
Is that what p-hacking is?
Yes. That is probably what happened. The thing is, it's hard to attribute motivations to the scientists, but it could be more like legit fraud, where you just want your study to be significant by any way, so you'll massage the data to make it as much as possible. There's also data fabrication. There have been some high-profile cases of legit data fraud, but what's likely in most cases is that it's just motivated reasoning, and people have strong incentives to get significant and surprising results. They'll get tenure, they'll get into top journals. Our employment depends on us publishing interesting findings in journals, and those incentives can push people to publish studies that are surprising and not replicable. And if you don't get an interesting result, you'll put it into what we call the file drawer, where it's never seen, it's never published, and you'll only publish a few of the studies that end up having a statistically significant, surprising conclusion. And that was a really bad incentive structure for science, and I think it encouraged the publication of not as replicable findings. Now, the thing is, I do think that science has gotten, especially social psychology, has gotten a lot better since that period of the replication crisis. We still have a lot of replication issues in our field, but after that, social psychology started pushing us to really have large samples, so we were less likely to get false positive results, to share our data openly, to share our code openly, to do something where we pre-register our findings, which means we write out our exact analysis plan before we publish the results, so we can't actually p-hack the results. And also, there are big replication projects that are happening in the field. So I think that social psychology has become, I think it's less dire than it was in the past, but I think there was a period where it got pretty bad and we're questioning a lot of results. But failed replications are also a natural part of science. In a lot of my papers, I try to replicate my studies several times. I'll do one study and then I'll do replication because I'm like, I want to see if this result is legit and not a false positive. And you can have better studies than other studies. Some will have a lot of internal replications, some won't. And also, I think as critical consumers of science, we shouldn't necessarily just believe in a one-off study because there are a lot of shoddy studies out there. What we should believe in instead is bodies of literature and meta-analyses and findings that have been replicated over and over again. You can see this with some scientists like Andrew Huberman, for instance, the famous podcaster, has been criticized for maybe cherry-picking a study showing that cold plunging has all these good effects. And then people will look at that study and be like, that is a shoddy study. So there are a lot of sort of shoddy studies that can support people's beliefs here and then, and people will be motivated to be like, oh, I like that study. That supports my beliefs. You'll have studies that show that, drinking a glass of wine a day is good for you. And then a lot of studies that show it's bad for you. And people will cherry pick whatever. And they'll probably want to believe the one showing that drinking wine is good for you. But I think it takes a lot of effort to be a critical consumer of science and to pay attention to sort of bodies of replicable evidence as opposed to one-off non-replicable studies. But it's still a big ongoing thing in the field, and it's something that we're still continuing to work out. Science is a big discussion, and there are tons of internal debates in the field. There are lots of debates about the effects of social media, and there are lots of disagreements, and that's kind of how science is. It's a big discussion, and everyone is searching for evidence, and it's in progress, and we update our beliefs, and sometimes we're wrong, and sometimes we're right, and sometimes there's a paradigm shift.
I'm glad you took the time to go through that and lay that out, because a topic that I keep coming back to in this show with multiple guests, whether it's science related or politics, is I'm really concerned about the deterioration of trust in our institutions here in America, because I think it's really important that we're able to trust the people that we elect to lead us or people we look to for guidance, people who know more about topics than we do. It's why I had on Dr. Monica Gandhi from UCSF. She specializes in immunology and HIV and AIDS research, and she was a big proponent and advocate for mRNA vaccines. But also it's why I had on Dr. Alina Chan. And that takes me to what we label misinformation and why. Because sometimes the label is based on something undeniably verifiable. Someone saying the Earth is flat is legitimate misinformation and always will be because we have literal astronauts in space right now who can verify that the Earth is in fact not flat. But sometimes that label, misinformation, can be motivated by politics or otherwise. And I recently spoke with Dr. Alina Chan about her hypothesis that COVID-19 likely escaped from a lab in Wuhan, China. I had her on the show back in 2021, and we spoke about that same topic. And back then, despite her educational pedigree, she's at MIT, and her academic bona fides, she was lumped in with conspiracy theorists, and the lab leak was widely labeled as misinformation. You might remember there was a period of time when even posting about that topic wasn't allowed on Facebook. But now we're in 2024. That theory is gaining traction. And just last month, Alina published an essay in the New York Times titled, quote, "Why the Pandemic Probably Started in a Lab in 5 Key Points." What I'm getting at, Steve, and this is like a topic that is really important to me, and from our conversation, it seems like it is very important to you as well, is that sometimes what is or is not misinformation is very clear to people, but sometimes it's fuzzy and even wholly subjective. Like I have a couple conservative relatives that I'm not going to name them. They're great people, but they're not public figures. When I have these conversations, whether it's political, scientific, etc., I try and keep them in the back of my mind when I'm having these conversations, because I think there are a lot of people out there, and I'm trying to steelman them, that are very wary of the term misinformation, because sometimes, not always, but sometimes it's used as a cudgel that some use to hammer their opponents or just write off their opinions, regardless of whether or not the label of misinformation is actually accurate. But I despair, Steve, because I think it's a really important label that needs to feel real to everybody, not just people on the left. How do we go about rehabilitating that word, misinformation, so that when anyone hears it, regardless of their political affiliation, they can trust it?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it's so complicated. And I sometimes avoid using the word misinformation because it is a really hard word and it's a really hard thing to define. And yeah, there are obvious clear-cut cases of misinformation, but then the lab leak is a big example of one where people's knowledge of the world changes. And there are some things where it's like, at one point we might think it's misinformation, that at a later point in time, it will become a reasonable hypothesis. And I think the lab leak is now a reasonable hypothesis, I would say. I don't know what the recent publication on it is well, but I don't think we would label it flat out misinformation anymore. My advisor, Jay Van Bavel, he actually studied COVID-19 conspiracy theories and he included a conspiracy theory about the lab leak in one of his studies. And then a peer reviewer actually noted this exact same point and said, like, this isn't really clearly misinformation or conspiracy theory anymore. And then he reanalyzed the data to exclude that item. So what I think is needed is, and there's research on this, my advisor, Sander van der Linder, does research on transparent communication of the facts by scientists. The thing is, like, scientists and officials and institutions are not perfect and will get things wrong. And I think some of that process needs to be transparently communicated, because I also thought a lot of trust was lost at the beginning of the pandemic with, there was a lot of polarization about Fauci and everything, and how at first they were saying masks were not good and then that they're good and everything like that. And I think what was perhaps lacking is transparent communication, like, we're figuring things out as we go. And this is the information as of current. That information is likely to change.
Why does that happen? Because every scientist I've spoken with, whether it's you or Dr. Gandhi or Dr. Chan, like every scientist I've ever spoken with is very humble about their own work, about their own assumptions, and about the process of science. Like, science is a process, it's not a result. Things keep getting refined, they get challenged by peers, things get revised. There's a lot of humility involved in science, but it seems like when anyone outside of the scientific field, they'll grab a study and run down the mountain with a stone tablet that says, this is capital T, capital S, the science. Why do you think that keeps happening? What is this pipeline where it goes from the humility of the people actually practicing the science to the lack of humility at the people reporting it?
It might be a lack of understanding of who these scientists are and what they're motivated by. There's certainly, on both sides, you can see like people on the left being like, oh, trust the science, but only pointing to science that agrees with their conclusion.
Yeah.
So motivated trust in science. And then people on the right who are extremely suspicious of scientists and view very sinister motives in them. And they don't really know who these scientists are, and they have sinister conspiracy theories. And I'm aware there's plenty of biased scientists, but I view this conservative outlook as really, really deeply cynical about what the actual motivations of scientists are. So it might be a lack of awareness. And then it also might be the fact that there are partisan opportunists on social media. My advisor calls these like architects of division on social media who are posting things. And often the most vocal people on social media are the most polarized and are the most extreme. And then we will have really unproductive debates about science as a result, which is why it's important, I think, when it comes to things like misinformation, we need to have solutions that are as nonpartisan as possible. As much as Elon Musk did terrible things for Twitter, I think one of the things that actually works on Twitter is the community notes feature. And it used to be called Birdwatch, where there's crowdsourced fact checking. And there is an algorithm basically behind community notes that looks at whether Democrats and Republicans or conservatives and liberals agree with the community notes response. So I think with labeling misinformation, it's actually quite important to have some sort of solution where it's like, okay, do conservatives and liberals who know the facts actually agree on this? It's important to look at this agreement, because if you don't have that, then you won't have trust, basically. And researchers in my lab, Claire Pretus and my advisor, Jay von Bavel, they did this study where if you showed people a social media post and you found that, like, if you're a Republican and you saw that other Republicans labeled this post as misleading, people would be much less likely to share it. And this goes to the social norm in the in-group norm type of thing. Like, if you see people on your side agreeing that this is misinformation, then you're much less likely to share it. And we've also done studies on fact checks before, and we found, for instance, that fact checks from your own in-group are much less likely to backfire than fact checks from your out-group. So that's why I think we both need sort of nonpartisan solutions. We need the perception of seeming nonpartisan, and we need people from our own side who correct our false beliefs. And I think as much as we might want to say that the other side is the only side sharing misinformation, us on the left probably need to be much more comfortable correcting falsehoods on the left as well. We should be aware of biases in our own community. So I think that's important. And I think it's also, there was a big thing where Nature, the top journal Nature, they endorsed Joe Biden for president, I believe. And they talked about how Donald Trump was quite dangerous to the scientific community at the time. And I agree that Donald Trump, he does spread falsehoods. He's dangerous to the scientific community. I agreed with everything Nature wrote there. However, there was a follow-up study that actually showed Republicans this endorsement of Joe Biden by Nature. And this made Republicans distrust science more. So when you saw, even though I totally agreed, Trump is terrible for democracy and says falsehoods and is harmful to the science and lies about the science, when you have sort of an institution being perceived by Republicans as being politically biased, this leads to negative consequences. So I think we need to be really careful about how we communicate about these tricky things like misinformation.
Your point about how hearing information that is either inconvenient to our side or its narrative or that challenges some part of our identity or what we believe, hearing that information from people in our quote unquote side is really important. I had a leader from the American Conservation Coalition, which is a conservative-led, youth-led organization that is looking to fight climate change. One of their core missions is to go into conservative spaces and say, we are you. We are one of you. We're not here to tell you how stupid you are. We're not here to say we know more than you. We are politically aligned with you, but we want to talk to you about this topic that we think is really important. And sometimes hearing that from people who identify with your quote-unquote tribe can make all the difference. I want to circle back to your TikTok account, which I highly recommend to anyone. I've always loved bite-sized bits of really fascinating information. I mean, I have books on my bookshelf that I got when I was 6 or 7 years old. Every birthday from like probably 6 through 12, my parents would get me some like fact-filled book. Like one was called Why Do Penguins Have Knees? The thematic similarity of all these books was you could turn to a new page and you would learn some new fact about the animal kingdom or about nature. Or why does Christmas land on December 25th? Or why do we celebrate Halloween? Who invented the toilet? Like everything from the patent system to why we believe what we believe. And I was always really fascinated with these little bite-sized pieces of history and facts and science. And it makes me think of your account in some kind of strange way, because you said you started it to, quote, share some of the coolest things that I have learned from my 7 or so years studying psychology, end quote. Now, that quote is from 2021, so it's almost 10 years of studying psychology.
I didn't even remember when I said that quote, so good job pulling that out, yeah.
As of this recording. And I really appreciate, Steve, what you're doing in that respect, because one of the show's earliest guests was a science communications expert from the USC Keck School of Medicine, specifically to talk about disinformation around skepticism about vaccines. But my question to you is, are there any dangers to short form psychology content? To flesh this out, speaking from experience, 100% there have been times when I've confidently referenced some study or some scientific factoid because I've read a headline off of CNN or Reddit, or I saw a short on YouTube. And then I find out months, sometimes years later, that what I said was either partially or wholly incorrect. And I would have known it was incorrect had I read the full study rather than a headline or just a snappy summary of it. And so I'm just saying I'm conflicted because there's a part of me as a big fan of these like catchy explainer videos, whether they're from like Fox or TikTok or wherever. But I'm also worried because it feels like these little snippets of information can get plucked out of really large, sometimes novel length studies and then shared by people who don't have your breadth and depth of knowledge. can the viral spread of little snippets of information that they themselves might be true, but are disconnected from the larger studies, can that be a kind of misinformation? And what do we do about it?
Yeah, I've actually thought about this a lot as a social media researcher who specifically studies the perverse incentive structures of social media companies, like the fact that social media incentivizes us to share engaging falsehoods or share outgroup animosity or share negative or overly emotional content in general, and that social media doesn't necessarily incentivize nuance. And it's also hard to be an educational creator as well, because educational content seems to be, in general, a bit more penalized on TikTok. It's harder to get seen by the algorithm if you're talking about a study, because most of TikTok is like comedy or memes or dances or something funny. And I am absolutely sort of beholden as well to all these incentive structures, which I say are perverse incentives. And it's also tough because I will make videos about things I want to make videos about. So sometimes I made a 5-minute video about scientific fraud and this big scientific fraud case with Francesca Gino. And I made a 3-minute video about the replication crisis. And these videos that I think are really important and educational, I think it's important that people know about the replication crisis, the things that we just talked about, and know all these nuances. And then after posting those videos, they won't go viral and they just won't really be seen by the audience because they're not snappy and engaging enough. And then I'll make a snappy and engaging video about conformity in the smoke-filled room, the example that we talked about earlier. And that will go like super duper viral. But then I'm like, what did I show people here? Because someone might be like, oh, this is how Republicans are. This is how Democrats are, blah, blah, blah. Like that's all they get from it is people conform. So it's hard to break through the noise. I am cynical about it in some of those ways, but I'm not completely cynical in that I would say my goal with TikTok is not necessarily to provide people the education they would get in the classroom, but maybe just to inspire people to learn that psychology is really interesting. I mean, I was absolutely blown away when I was a freshman and I took Psychology 1 and I learned these amazing studies. It was one of the coolest things I've ever experienced. And I want to give people that sense of just awe and excitement about psychology. And perhaps that will lead them to become more interested in psychology or research this stuff in more depth, or I can maybe be like this spark of inspiration, basically, because with a few short form videos with 30 seconds of people's attention, I can't really give them like a nuanced education or anything, but maybe I can inspire them to look in psychology further. So that inspires me to think like I am maybe doing a positive thing and I'm giving, millions of people some greater awareness of how interesting psychology is that they didn't necessarily have previously, or a specific topic in psychology. And I try to be as careful as possible about how accurate I am and not taking stuff out of context and trying not to be like negative about, some people in educational TikTok have gone really viral off of like fact checks. And fact checks are great, but like the perception from the audience is like, oh, this person is dissing on this person, they're having a feud, and then that kind of goes viral. It's like a celebrity feud or whatever. We're sort of attracted to conflict. So I try not to fall for that, even though I've done a few fact checks before, but I try not to fall into sort of the trap of being like, oh, to go viral, I have to be really negative, or I have to be whatever, I have to talk about celebrities. I try to just go viral off of the strength of the content anyway. And I try not to let my like incentive to go viral overstep my incentive for accuracy. And I think the fact that I'm a scientist and science comes first and being respected by my scientific peers in the scientific community keeps me from posting viral stuff that would be not as accurate. But yeah, TikTok is a flawed platform, but all sorts of platforms are flawed. Podcasts, for instance, I love podcasts and I learn so much from them, but I think that there are benefits and drawbacks to podcasts. Like there's something about long form discussions that make you really start to like the person you're listening to and kind of have a parasocial relationship with. And I think that can sometimes lead to, let's talk about vaccine misinformation on Joe Rogan. You'll listen to 3 hours with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And after a while, it'll be like, oh, this isn't so bad. And it will be out of context. But because you were along for the 3-hour ride, you start to be like, oh, maybe this kind of sounds reasonable. So yeah, all sorts of these mediums have their dangers, especially if they're not incentivized to create accurate environments.
You're struggling with a problem that has existed probably since at least the invention of the television. I mean, there's a lot of similarities between the content you make, even if it's shorter form, and the stuff that Carl Sagan was doing 40 some odd years ago with Cosmos or Nova. Speaking of television and performance, you grew up in Portland, Oregon. And as a child, you were a self-described theater kid.
Yes, I was.
At that time, you had aspirations of becoming a playwright or an actor. But when you began college at Stanford, you took an introduction to psychology course and everything changed. And I just wanted to know why.
So the thing is, I didn't love school growing up. It wasn't really, I got in good grades, I guess. But it wasn't, no one has a good experience with middle school and also high school.
It's tough, yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't great. So what was really my refuge was the theater, and I was doing professional acting when I was a middle schooler as well. And I would often be the only kid there around in a play with all adults. And that was really inspiring to me and a huge education for me to be in this adult professional world and see people really serious about what they were doing. And I absolutely loved it. And then I got super into playwriting, and I was doing all sorts of playwriting competitions or having my plays produced. And that was so also stimulating. And I guess what I liked outside of just acting is playwriting was intellectual, I guess. I didn't love school. I didn't really identify as an academic or anything. I would always tell my mom I'm not an academic growing up, which is ironic now that I've become an academic is my profession. But I was just not interested in school, but I was interested in exploring human questions of emotions and the human behavior. I just thought that was so interesting. When I got into Stanford, I was maybe I'll study theater, maybe I'll study English, maybe I'll study psychology. I did have this vague interest in psychology, but not super developed. And then I took an intro to psychology course at Stanford that was so well taught by this very well-known, amazing professor named James Gross. And it blew me away. And I was still playwriting at the time, and I was integrating a lot of what I was learning in this class into my play. And I would talk about memory, and I would talk about everything. And I was just so fascinated by these findings. And I sort of realized the joy that I was getting out of theater and art was not that different from the joy I was getting out of psychology. It was that same sort of intellectual engagement with what it means to be human and exploring all these really interesting human questions. So I got involved in psychology research, and I also got involved in science communication quite early. During my senior year of college, I started blogging for Psychology Today. I took a science communication course with David Eagleman, who's sort of one of the well-known science communicators. He's written books and stuff, which was really inspiring. And out of that, I had the opportunity to write an article for The Guardian about framing effects in psychology. And that was so cool to integrate my writing interest with my interest in communicating psychology. And I got to see how people responded to it and were inspired by it. Then eventually I did the PhD, but I loved doing science. I love the research process, and I love the process of writing up manuscripts because it's the same talent of writing a play. It's very similar, but I also love that experience of communicating science with the general public. And all of that same stuff I did when I was doing playwriting, I feel I do in my psychology research. Having a discussion with you today about science doesn't feel too different than having a discussion about theater at all. It all feels very similar to me. That's kind of how I approach science, I think.
Reminds me of something a directing teacher told me in film school back at USC years ago. Probably the most influential directing teacher I had, Jeremy Kagan. And the first day of his course, he said, any director or actor worth their salt needs to know a lot about psychology and how and why people think the things they think. And he recommended a couple psychology books. And I went on Amazon that night. I just read them cover to cover as quickly as I could. And that connection between performance, between directing, between understanding the human mind and actually studying psychology itself is such a straight line. So it makes sense to me how you went from one field to another.
I really don't think they're different things. And I think there's a huge theater to psychology pipeline and psychology to theater pipeline.
It's a gateway drug.
It definitely is. Yeah. And also theater to TikTok pipeline. Everyone who's a TikToker seems to be a former theater kid.
We're never going to be rid of misinformation. With algorithmic incentives on social media and that timeless combo of group conformity and motivated reasoning forever dogging us. But I was really inspired by what you and your colleagues were able to demonstrate when it came to a toolbox of individual level interventions. What were some of your key takeaways from this research that we can use to become better at discerning legitimate information from propaganda? Or to put it another way, how can we become better seekers of truth?
First of all, the number one thing that would work would probably be a structural intervention and not an individual level intervention. So if regulation or social media companies or something decided to put less junk in our feeds or incentivize less junk, that would probably be the most effective thing. It's like the thing that policy solutions are often more effective than individual solutions. But I'm not super hopeful that social media companies are suddenly going to change their incentive structure, or that like Congress or politicians will figure out intelligent regulation anytime soon. That might come someday, but they've been really struggling. So while we don't have those, I think we do have a number of individual level interventions. And this paper looked at some of the key individual level interventions that are effective at helping reduce misinformation. Some of these are just to provide people basic media literacy tips. So studies have shown that if you just tell people basic media literacy, if you say, look at the source, if you say, think carefully about whether a post is true, is it a recognizable source, check your sources. There are all sorts of things you can do to be a more literate consumer of media. And I think that's something we need to really teach in schools. We need to teach media literacy, especially among like Gen Z who grows up on TikTok. They need to be a little bit more aware and skeptical and, know how to fact check information. There's also my advisor, Sander van der Linden, my PhD advisor. He did a lot of work on what he calls inoculation. And that's preemptively warning people about misinformation before it happens. And you've actually seen social media platforms have done that right before an election. They'll say, be careful about election misinformation on the platform. You might hear false claims about this and this and this, and this is what they might look like. And this is similar to media literacy. He's also found that if you teach people about logical fallacies, or if you say, be careful of emotional language, it often tries to manipulate you. This makes people better at spotting misinformation. There are other researchers who have focused on something called the accuracy nudge, which is similar to what I've talked about with accuracy incentives. That if you just nudge people subtly to think about accuracy a little bit more on social media, this can make people more accurate. And of course, there's also fact checking as well. We found in general that fact checks tend to be effective. And this can be done in all sorts of ways. There are professional fact checkers who, as social media platforms, put warning labels on posts that are known to contain misinformation. So there's fact checking as well. Another thing that's outside this paper, but I just want to speak of because it's a study that I just wrote up and we're just about to preprint and submit. We incentivize people in a large-scale study to go to their Twitter feed, and we incentivize them to go through a list of polarizing accounts or accounts rated as low quality by fact checkers. We said that we'd pay them to unfollow all of these, less accurate and more polarizing accounts for a month. And we paid them around $30 to $40 to do that. And we found really remarkable effects in our study. We found that paying people to unfollow these polarizing and false accounts reduced polarization with effects lasting for at least a month after the study was done. So we followed people for, up to a year after the study, and we found these big effects on polarization. And we also found that unfollowing these accounts led people to, in general, share and interact with more accurate news. So it also improved their behavior, and it made them feel like their Twitter experience was more positive. So this is something that could be both implemented structurally. Social media companies could make their algorithms show you less polarizing info and junk news, but it can also be done individually. I frequently go through my Twitter following lists and my multiple following lists, and I try to curate my following list to be a little bit less polarizing. So that's another thing that we could do.
I really appreciate the work that you're doing, Steve, both the deep research and scientific papers you and your colleagues are publishing, and the informative and entertaining science videos you're making on TikTok to your million-plus followers. With all the people out there who are more concerned with going viral than being accurate, it is a blessing to have people like you who do care about accuracy, truth, fairness, on the front lines, competing for attention spans. So as concerned as I am about building public trust back into our institutions, your work and your advocacy makes me feel better about our shared future. So Steve, thank you for your work. And today, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. This was a super interesting conversation. So thanks so much for all the good and well-researched questions.
It's my pleasure.